Well, welcome. Whether this is your first time or maybe a repeat time coming in here, it's my pleasure to introduce you to a little bit of what's going on here at the Wyrd Experience. My name is Jeff Dunn. I am the son of Brenda Dunn, who was one of the two founders of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, which is sort of the original source of the equipment and the science that we're going to talk about here. And what we're going to do is try to give you a little bit of background as to what happened and then what eventually motivated all of this to fly over the Atlantic and land here in Yorkshire. The origins of this started with Professor Robert John at Princeton University. He was at the time the dean of the School of Engineering, and a student had come in to talk to him one day about replicating an experiment that she had learned about that was done over in Stanford, where they had set up a device, and the idea was that the device in and of itself would generate random numbers, and that an operator would sit in front of it and attempt to influence what numbers came out. When Bob John had heard about this, his initial reaction was, well, why would you expect there to be any effect whatsoever? And she had explained, well, there was. And he wasn't particularly convinced that such a thing could be possible. But she had explained that, look, that she had talked about it with all the other professors and wanted to do this as part of her student research. And nobody else would oversee the project. And he agreed that while maybe he didn't think that it was something that would produce results, he had to admit that it was a great engineering project. It involved design of systems, design of protocols, analysis of data, and the whole thing. And so he agreed to supervise the project. At the end of it, looking at the results, they had indeed replicated what was done at SRI, which is Stanford Research Institute, I believe, and discovered indeed there was a difference in the output of the device depending on the intentions of the operator. In other words, you could get more ones than zeros on your sort of electronic coin flipper. And although the student then said, okay, that's great, and went off to do other things, here he was trying to figure out, what do you do with that? Here was something that was a real effect that was nobody understood it, and nobody, and he couldn't let it go. He couldn't just say, well, okay, whatever, and go back to the other work that he was doing entirely. And so he decided that he needed to set up a research program for it. He had spoken to people that he knew in the aerospace field. His other work was in aerospace and electric propulsion, and discovered that this kind of phenomenon was not an unknown thing. That, for example, this particular case, the idea of what they would call, I think, gremlins, or sort of the gremlins in the machine, or whatever they call it, it was a well-known effect to pilots that the equipment would behave strangely under times of stress, and so said, look, if you'll study this, I'll fund it. And so with funding in hand, he set out to set up a lab. And sort of a long story that I will not go into here, but that's something that you can read about in other places, found Brenda Dunn, and together they set up the lab. One of the things that was particularly important in identifying Brenda, as opposed to other people, was a desire to, or maybe I should say, a recognition of the need to have a complementary pair of people running this, that it needed that complementary aspect to it. So he was specifically looking for somebody who was very different than he was. He was very, Brenda, my mother would describe it as, he was the particle where she was the wave. He was very analytic, very scientific, very to the point, and in contrast, she was very very holistic, right? Kind of would look at things from the overall picture, not instead of going sort of straight to the end question or as quickly as possible, wanted to take in the whole of the picture before coming to an answer. And I think because of this, the laboratory that they established had a very special feeling to it. And in fact, the couch that I'm sitting on right now is sort of representative of that. The whole point of it was to make people comfortable when they came in. So people didn't feel as if they had walked into sort of a sterile laboratory environment, but rather into some place where they could be comfortable. They could sit down, they could have a chat. And when people did come into the laboratory, that's exactly what would happen. They wouldn't just sort of come in and say, okay, sit, do experiment, now leave. They came in, they talked, they had coffee and cookies and what have you. And they would do experiments by, I don't know if there's any within arm's reach, but they would pick up their favorite stuffed animal. In this particular case, maybe it would be a cat. And it was not uncommon to see people hugging their favorite stuffed animal as they would do their experiment. This was sort of the whole point of the way it was set up. So there were stuffed animals all over the place. The work that, or I should say the experiments that were done there were a wide variety of different experiments, and what we're going to do here is just give you a bit of an introduction to what the different experiments were, and we'll just sort of talk about it briefly, and then kind of at the end, I think, wrap up with just a little bit of a discussion about what they found in doing the research. So, the first and sort of most prominent feature of the lab was this device over here. This was nicknamed Murphy. Its technical name is that it is a random mechanical cascade. And what it is a device where a set of balls, we've got a few hundred maybe that are in here right now, and a little over 1,000 that are in the bottom. And I'll turn this on in a moment. You'll see it operating with just 100 of them dropping or something like that. That would fall through this set of pegs, and as they bounced around, they would eventually fall into this set of 19 bins. And in general, what you would expect from something like this is that the balls would mostly fall in the middle, and a few would fall on the left, some on the right, and in general it would make this Gaussian distribution or bell-shaped curve through the middle. And for the most part, that is precisely what happened. The goal of an operator sitting on that couch would be to try to influence the balls to go a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right. And the way that the experiments were done is they always were done in sets of 3. So you would do a baseline where you wouldn't try to have any effect whatsoever. You just let the machine do what the machine's going to do. And then you would run the whole thing. Now, when they were running it, they had 9,000 balls. So the whole process took 15-20 minutes to do one of those. You do a baseline, and then you would do one where you try to get more balls to go to the right than to the left, and then finally the last would be more balls to the left than to the right. You'd look at how the distribution had changed over that. To kind of steal from the thunder of the end, what they discovered was, yes, the intention of trying to move it to the left or to the right made a difference, and that the distributions would shift. They didn't always shift the way that you wanted them to, but there were shifts in each case. So let me just give you a very brief feeling for how it runs. Right now it's in a state of slight, it's still in the stage of construction. So for example, there isn't a plate along the front of it, so we're not going to let it run too long, because if the balls start piling up any higher than this, they will be piling up on the floor. So we will not do that, but I will let the balls that are in here fall down, and then we'll start the belt. And I should perhaps mention that when it was running there would be a counter. that you would see here, it's off for the moment, and that's simply because we actually have the counter working, but it runs through a computer, and the computer's not here at the moment. But you can imagine sort of a digital display that was throughout here. And let's start. Now, what you may have noticed is that in addition to some balls falling down here, some balls fell out. Now you might ask why. And it is actually, it's a great thing that that the machine's in a little bit of a state of disrepair, and some of the balls have fallen out on the floor. And the reason is because, as I said a little bit ago, the machine is known as Murphy. And the reason it's known as Murphy is because it is the embodiment of Murphy's Law. So if there is something that can go wrong with it, it does. In this particular case, it did not occur to me that this might have become slightly loose. And of course, since I did not think that it might, it did. And hence some of the balls that normally would fall out through the back here started falling out through the front. But this really is the essence of this machine. It took several years to get it functioning, and as we're rebuilding it here at Broughton, we're going through the same process and sort of some of the same heartaches that they went through at the Paralab in trying to get it set up. It really took several years, and each time they thought they had everything working, then something else would happen, and they'd realize, oh, that didn't work. There were times that included things like having 9,000 balls in here that went onto the floor. Sometimes it was just a question of the balls getting stuck in various places or the counter's not working. But this was an ongoing thing, and it wasn't until sort of the early beginning of the 80s, I think, when the device was fully consistent in what it was doing, and they started to collect the data. So this was sort of absolutely the loudest and most sort of physical of the devices that were there. There are other physical devices, and there are others that we'll talk about in a moment, and there are others that are purely digital, electronic. So, but this definitely is sort of the icon of the lab, and it's what people normally think about. Okay. So let me move around, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order, just to go through the order as we've got them laid out here at the Wyrd experience, and I'm going to end with what really is sort of the next experiment that was done, but in this particular case, it makes sense to end with that because it's sort of the equipment that is most well known ultimately. Some of the other experiments that were here, this particular one is pendulum. And the way that this would work is that there is a pendulum arm, which is currently kind of taped up and what have you, that would be raised to a side and then released. At the center is a little photo gate, and as the pendulum would go back and forth through it, it would recognize when it had passed by, and the operator was instructed to sit in front of it and concentrate on the device and attempt to affect the swing of the pendulum. So can you make it, for example, continue to swing longer, to not damp out from friction, or to somehow change the period of the pendulum away from its natural frequency? And it was not one of the most used experiments. That was definitely Murphy and the RNGs that I'll mention at the end. But there was a good amount of data that was collected with it, and what was found was indeed, that operators could have this effect. This also obviously has a physical aspect to it. This is not working right now, and I think will probably be another couple of years potentially until it actually is. But you can see it's inside a case, and the point of this was to eliminate air currents and to make sure that there weren't other factors that were going to impact the pendulum. So moving over here, this device was a fountain, so also a very physical device, and there would be water on this left side, and it would create a little up spurting up of water that was that would sort of have an average height, and the operators were instructed to try to affect that in general the height of the water as it went up, but it didn't have to be. It could also be changing sort of the character or the point at which it went into a turbulent flow situation. So the fountain would kind of bounce up and down. And there's some videos online of all of these working that you can definitely check out. Again, also same kind of results. One of the reasons that they did a lot of different experiments was to see if people would resonate more or less with one device or another, or if somehow having something more, for example, in this particular case, something that was more like fundamental, right? Water, one of the four elements, something that we're mostly water. Maybe there's something in there. And what I found is, no, it didn't really matter. You would get the same kind of effects, same sort of magnitude of effects, same quirks and the effects as you did for all the other devices. It really didn't make much of a difference. Another example of what was tried in that was this experiment with the drum. And here, this is not hooked up at the moment. This is going to be much later, but it's a traditional drum. And the mallet was hooked up to a random event generator that drove it to beat in different ways. So if you would affect the REG that was driving this, maybe you would get changes in the intensity of the swing or changes in frequency. So something like that. This one kind of blurs over into the sort of the electronic side of the house, because it was an electronic device that was driving this primarily, and you were really trying to affect that. Similar to that, and this one by far the most popular with kids, but to be honest, probably the most popular with almost everybody, was the robot. And what this is a random event generator that is controlling a little robot. The frog sitting on top of it goes for the ride, and the goal in this experiment was to try to influence where the robot would go. So the most common way that it was used was you would line up, especially a group of school kids around the side, and they would all sit there and go, come here, come here, come here, come here, come here, come to me, come to me, come to me. Interesting that it was come to me when I said that. And then wherever it would sort of end, one of the children would go, yay, I won. But there were also sort of more science, data collection activities with this, but I don't know that it was really published in the same sense that the other ones were. But it was exciting to do, and it was very popular because of the frog that sits on top of it. That just made people sort of naturally drawn to it, I think. So, turn it off here so it doesn't spend the rest of eternity wandering around. Also driven by a random event generator, which sort of is the natural extension to the workhorse of the data collection that happened, which is random event generators. The essence of these is that they have an internal noise source, and the details of those kind of change depending on which REGs you're talking about, so I'm not going to get into the fine details of what the random noise source are, but those are documented in research papers and all that sort of thing as well. The original, the biggest one, started down here, so you can kind of get a feeling for it used to be that big. And then for sort of the majority of data that was collected over the years, it was this device. Later in time, so somebody would sit in front, they would have this, and they would hit the button to start a run, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. And then as time went on and technology advanced, they started getting smaller until they were this size, and then eventually this size. And then after the laboratory had closed and people were looking to do additional experiments elsewhere, they ultimately were about this size. And this particular one is a Celeron REG, a random event generator, although there are other places that manufacture random event generators as well. The way that this is structured is it at the core produces ones and zeros. But the essence of it is that you would have a particular batch of ones and zeros that were generated, usually 200, and you would add them up. And so this device on one of the displays would show you a number that was the sum of all the ones and zeros. And if it was operating without any kind of influence, you would have as many ones as zeros. So in general, you'd get a number that was somewhere around 100. Of course, it's a random source. You don't always get 100. Sometimes you get 101, sometimes it's 97, sometimes it's 103, whatever it is, and it varies. When you did the experiment the same way for Murphy, that you would try to have one baseline and then one where you push the balls to the left and one that you push the balls to the right. The same kind of thing would happen here. You would run one sequence where you would run a set of numbers, so you'd get and the size of the batches of these numbers that you would do vary depending on the experimental protocol. So maybe it would be 100 100s, that you were aiming for. But you would run it and you would let it run and see that, okay, I got 101, 97, 103, 94, 97, 102, and it would do this, and you'd get a series of numbers. And this will also be displayed ultimately at the end when we get a computer, one of the modern machines to show you an example of this. So you would let it run through once without trying to do anything. That would be your baseline. And then you would try to do one where you influence the numbers to be higher, so you'd get more ones than zeros. And then one where you try to make it lower, so you get more zeros than ones. And then you would take a look at the results of that. And if you found that you were getting an extreme number of ones more than zeros, you would see this in the output as this particular curve, which is tracing the results, going up and up and up. And at some point you're going up so high that you've exceeded the sort of reasonable expectation from chance, and you'd say, I've got something that's highly significant in a statistical way, or down, whichever. And so you would do this, and this was by far the sort of the largest data collection experiment that the Pear Lab did. Let me show you briefly on here what this looked like. Hopefully this is still on. So this is an example of the output. Can you get a good view of it? This is maybe something that was running by chance, at least because it's not so far down as to be extraordinary in its own sense, or on the other side, so high up as to fall outside of that sort of parabola of expected variation. And the way that this would get collected, and this particular software, which is running off of the Celerons, it doesn't give you a specific baseline option. So it's saying, what's your intention, high or low? And you just pick one of these. I'll just pick high, and I'm picking high really because the red line is easier to see probably on the camera. And as the data is collected, you're getting ones and zeros. And if you're getting more ones, the line's going to go up. And as you're getting more zeros, it's going to go down. And as you go through this whole thing, it's going around. Now, I don't have a particular intention on it. Of course, having said that, now it's going to define and go somewhere else down below. But this is kind of the way that the data collection would go, is you would have this continue to collect information, and this is actually going to be a beautiful example of something that I was going to mention before. So we'll just let it finish for a moment and see if it creeps back into the curve. No, it's going to end on the outside. Okay, wonderful. One of the interesting things about the data is that there were a lot of variables that went into what the effect was. For example, certainly the strongest effect was people who did it for the first time, very first experiment, almost always had really tremendous results. It was just the strongest results you ever saw were that person's first time sitting down and running the experiment. And not surprising, because we've all sort of experienced that beginner's luck kind of thing. So maybe it doesn't surprise people too much. And so what would happen is people would say, aha, I can do it. This is wonderful. And they would run it again. And then the effect would go away. Because just this overconfidence or whatever it is. And then as they continue to do experiments, the effect would return. Rarely as strongly as it was originally for that very first one, but it would come back. Over time, as the data came in, and the amount of data that was collected out of this was enormous over the course of the 27 years that the laboratory was operating. And the results, which, like for example, in this particular curve, the examples just fell outside the line, and you say, okay, well, this isn't likely to happen by chance. This isn't like your 1 in 5 possibility. This is more like 1 in 20 or 1 in 25 chance that it would do that. Okay, that's fine. But you run it 25 times and it keeps doing this. That's substantial. Well, this process was done so often that the chances of the anomalous behavior that was being observed being just chance was 1 in billions. It was just astronomically unlikely that this kind of behavior could have occurred by chance. And it was the scientific capture of that made the results of the Paralab as important as they are, because in doing this, they established a very engineeringly rigorous data set that demonstrated this really happens. And it happens with ordinary people. The laboratory, because it was in an engineering school, did not go out and, first of all, it didn't study people, but it deliberately made a point of not having gifted people or people who came in who said, oh, I'm really good at this, let me do this. It was students at the university. It was people who had heard about it and just said, that's really interesting, I want to come by and I want to try it. There was no, let me go get the super psychic kind of thing to come do the experiments. And in doing so, in collecting data from normal people and showing consistently that this effect was real, it laid the groundwork for all the work that followed, really. And I think that was one of the things that was exciting about it. The work itself had a lot of findings that were very exciting. One of which is that through intention, a human can, through their conscious intention, affect systems that were around them, right? Inexplicably, by modern sort of traditional scientific approach, in ways that couldn't be explained, right? There was the random mechanical cascade demonstrated from a kinetic kind of effect. These demonstrated it from something that you wouldn't necessarily call kinetic. There was an entire program in remote viewing that I haven't even talked about. I probably won't get into in this. But all kinds of modalities of the experiment showed that this is a real thing. And they did a lot of experiments trying to then demonstrate it. How does it work? What do you do to make it work better, or what have you? Does it work better for men or women? Does it work better if you're old or young? Men and women, it doesn't really work better, but it does seem to work differently. Probably less accurate to say men versus women versus as opposed to masculine versus feminine. But children tended to be better at it than adults because they hadn't learned not to by that point. Just for the masculine and feminine effects was a particularly interesting one. For example, masculine operators tended to get results that were generally in the direction that they intended. Feminine operators tended to get much stronger results, but typically opposite the direction that they intended. So if they wanted the curve to go up, it went down, but it went really down. Whereas men, if they wanted the curve to go up, it generally went up, but maybe not as strikingly. They did other experiments as well, which went beyond the gender aspects of this and the sort of personality type things to the extent that they could, because again, not studying people, so they weren't doing personality tests or anything like that. But it does beg the question that if I can affect the machine there, what would happen if I took one step over this way? And then what if the machine wasn't in the same room with me? What if it was in the next room over? What if it was in the next state over? What if it was in the next country over? What if it was on the next continent? What if it was halfway around the world? And what they discovered is that distance doesn't really have anything to do with it. It doesn't matter where you are relative to the machine. The intent was enough to have the effect. And that, of course, begs you to ask the other question, which is if space doesn't have anything to do with the effect, what about time? So they ran a series of experiments in which you would have a machine running, but the person trying to influence it would try to influence it a week earlier or a week later. And similarly, what they discovered is that time doesn't really have anything to do with it either. That it doesn't matter when you're trying to have the effect, so long as you're running the experiment in a sort of a structured way, so that, for example, the experimenter isn't aware of the results and then trying to affect the results, because once you know the results, it's sort of, that's quantum mechanically, you've collapsed the wave function, as it were. The cat's out of the bag. The results are what the results are, and that's the end of it. So there was just a tremendous amount of work that then followed up on that and explaining or trying to develop models to help explain why this would be the case. And those are perhaps a good talk for another time, because we could spend a tremendous amount of time going into all of that. But this is at least gives you a little bit of a feeling for what the lab was like, and hopefully has piqued your curiosity enough that you'll be interested in learning more.
What would you say were the most surprising results that Per discovered?
I think time, certainly the invariance with time, was very surprising. Traditionally, you expect that when you're trying to have an effect, you're going to try to have an effect in the moment, and that what's happening is now. That you could affect a system that was happening a week ago, or something that is not going to be happening for a week till. And by the way, week is kind of just an arbitrary thing. Doesn't matter if it's a week or a month or a year. That was very unexpected, I think. Once they had started seeing some of the effects and noticing that different operators had kind of different signatures to them to some extent, it wasn't, for example, so much of a surprise that genders would have different effects. And similarly, it wasn't as much of a surprise that when they started doing experiments where you would have groups of people trying to do things, two people, that there were different effects. For example, if there were two people who had just met, or two people who were good friends, or two people who were sort of bonded pairs, all of those things were factors in the results. But by that point, I think that wasn't surprising by the time that came about. The effects and the understanding had evolved at that point. That they would, I think, would have been surprised if that had not been the case. So,
And so that lack of surprise is related to the fact that Pear was establishing the role of emotions in the experiments?
I think so. It's sort of a yes, although answer. Emotions are involved in it, but they're involved in it because of the role, I think, in how one establishes relationships. Ultimately, what seemed to really make the difference when you talk to people afterwards and said, "Well, what worked? What were you trying to do now versus then?" There were aspects of the idea of intending that work better than others. People who kind of took on a demanding aspect to this, "You will do what I want," rarely had much of an effect. What was much more effective was trying to establish some kind of relationship with the device. So it instead of just trying to impose your will on a thing to establish something of a friendship where you now could reach out to the device and, "Hey, I have an idea. Why don't you and I do something that will make the balls fall to the right? Why don't we have the curve go up as opposed to down?" And those sorts of things were much more effective when you started to establish the resonance. And recognizing that resonance was involved, now you can see why the resonance between humans that would affect it would be a factor in this, and where the emotions come from, because the emotions are really often how we're tying in best to the resonances that we're experiencing. Most of the time when you feel a resonance with somebody, it's at an emotional level. So that makes a lot of sense and looked at that way.
Are there two or three principles in quantum physics that you see being demonstrated here?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. The complementarity aspects of quantum mechanics it just plays itself out beautifully here. The idea that there are pieces that are coming together to make a reality. The idea that what's going on in quantum mechanics when you make a measurement in terms of collapsing a wave function is similar here, maybe identical. It would be a better way of describing it. This is really about going through the process of observation, which is to say to remove the uncertainty and to make that request of nature to take a stand. The quantum in the quantum mechanics example, you say, well, I've got some particle thing that is, I'm asking it to be a particle. And then hence it has a particulate nature, and I'm going to measure where is the position of this thing. As opposed to, if I expect it to behave like a wave, I look for it like a wave, it behaves like a wave. Probably the most important aspect of this that does play into all of this at really sort of the philosophical levels as well as the quantum mechanical levels is the role of uncertainty. That uncertainty is an essential part of this process. That if the more you try to eliminate the uncertainty in what you're doing, you eliminate essentially the magic of what's going on. The remote perception examples, the remote perception experiments that they did that I said I wasn't going to try to get into just as a matter of time were really a fantastic example of that. What Pear had done was to establish grading criteria, and they were trying to create the best rubric that they could to measure the effect or the effectiveness of a remote viewing experiment. And what they found is that there was kind of a sweet spot where they captured enough information about what was perceived or received where you could appreciate so what was going on. You could appreciate the effect that indeed there was information being transferred. But as their protocol tried to narrow it down to more and more precise things, it essentially destroyed the effect. It turned the thing into such a rigid structure that the effect kind of vanished. There needed to be a certain amount of uncertainty in that with which you could play. And similarly, I would argue that's sort of the way things are for life. And it's not the first time that sort of thing has been proposed or discovered or discussed. if you look back at the mythologies of ancient Greece, right, and the idea of what was Cassandra's curse about the role of prophecy and the fact that, you know, if you want to have an effect on the world, you can't know what's going to happen in the world, right? I mean, so the ideas of that have been around for thousands of years, but this demonstrates it in a pretty exciting way because it's done it from an engineering perspective as opposed to something that's a little more story-based. Yeah.
Awesome. And maybe just one more question.
Sure.
Your vision of the Wyrd experience going forward?
Yeah, also a great question. The I absolutely should have talked about that. My goodness, how did I forget? The goal of the Wyrd experience and setting this whole thing up, the intent was to take this this equipment and establish something of a living museum, or an experiential museum is a better way of describing that, where people could come in and see the equipment, play with the equipment, and get that experience for themselves. People, as they've come in, even as we've just started this, it's really only been open for a year now, but people come in and they do experiments. Primarily, they've done it with the RNGs because Murphy's still in the process of being reconstructed. But you can see as people come in, it's like, okay, I think I understand what you're doing or what you're saying, and then there's a hesitance. And then you have them sit in front of an RNG and look at the display. And, you know, the baseline does what the baseline does. It kind of sits around, and every once in a while it bounces up and down. And sometimes you get, but then you say, well, put an intention on it. And then the curve does this. There's nothing more convincing to be the person sitting there making that happen and realizing you're having an effect. And that's what this is all about, is to help people understand that all this stuff, right, all this weird stuff, and whether you think of that as the traditional word of weird or the WYRD weird, which is the interconnectedness interpretation of this, this is real. This is what, if we can make this expectation the norm, right, we're going to make the world a much better place in just countless ways, and the experience of humanity in that world a much more rewarding one. So,
awesome.
all right.
Fantastic. Okay, Jeff, well, what do you think the music is playing outside? Yeah. Wonderful. I love, actually, it almost reminds me of the Garage Lab of Apple. And here we are, Garage Lab of Pear.
Yeah.
Maybe Steve Jobs is
right
here in some shape or form.
Oh, well, you know, as it was very much a garage kind of situation, in the sense that the lab, the space that they identified for it, was in the basement of the engineering building. And people would kind of be led down their hallways and go, oh, we're going in here. I didn't realize there was an experiment going on in here. Yep. But it kind of added to it ultimately, because like I said, it gave you that I'm at home. I'm working in the world of humanity, and yeah, it's fun.